Very welcome, Aaron Proffitt. So happy to have you for the Center for Contemplative Traditions for the University of Leipzig. This time we open a very different window into one of the many Buddhisms that we talk about as your professor for Japanese studies, but at the same time you're a Shin practitioner. And I know so little about your transmission, about your tradition, but also about the scholarship of Japanese Buddhism as a whole. So I'm very happy to have you here and hope we can open many new windows to different approaches and Dharma teachings that
Yeah,
I also have never heard about.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to share some of the stuff that that I research, some of the stuff that I have been able to experience in practice, and just life of the Dharma, right? And I'm also excited to learn more about your tradition as well because I have a bit of experience with Himalayan and Tibetan traditions, and there's actually a lot of overlap. There's a lot of similarities, but I think because we often get kind of bifurcated into the East Asia side or the Tibetan Himalayan side, we miss some of these points of commonality.
Yeah, when I was informing myself a little bit beforehand what the Shin school is, and
Sure.
I saw that basically most what I heard about Japanese Buddhism was actually either about Shingon, Tendai,
Hmm.
so-called Tantric Buddhism, or
Sure.
about Zen. I heard very little about, I knew it existed, Pure Land Buddhism. So it of course triggers a lot of references in myself, so that I know from the Tibetan tradition where we have
Hmm.
along with the practice of the different Tibetan schools, and like I
Hmm.
myself know mostly the Kagyupa and the Nyingma schools that have all
Hmm.
these different transmissions, either from the sutras or from the tantras, where you either pray to Buddha Amitabha with the wish to be reborn in the pure land of Buddha Amitabha, but also you have a dimension of practicing Buddha Amitabha in the present, like
Yes. Yeah.
being the state of the Buddha in the shape of Buddha Amitabha or
Yeah.
Amitayus. This different approaches welled up when I was considering it, all the
Sure.
way
Sure.
from the prayer to an external Buddha to a distant land to the very present of the Buddha and the revealing of Buddha nature in the form of Buddha Amitabha.
So in the text that I worked on for my book, Esoteric Pure Land Buddhism, there are several interesting passages that talk about this issue. Is Amitabha something outside of oneself, something that is arising and functioning naturally as a part of your practice and your experience of the path? And in one part, he says that the distance of the Pure Land is a function of the mind. It's not, so like it's not an objective reality. It's, if you're the type of being who is far removed from your Buddha nature, then you will perceive it as distant, right? Whereas if you're a little more, hip to what's going on, then you're going to understand that Amitabha Buddha is Buddha nature, alaya, consciousness, emptiness, etc. Right? Nirvana, perhaps as a dynamic aspect of your experience of the path, not some abstract thing to be attained far away. So that's within the Shingon tradition, but one of the other things that I emphasize in my book is that the doctrinal or sectarian categories that we have today that might make sense in contemporary Japanese Buddhism, you have head temples, branch temples, founders, teachings, texts, all that stuff. That's really a relic of the 1600s and on. Right, so the 1600s, the beginning of the Tokugawa era of peace in Japan, you have this sudden shift towards sectarianization, where basically in the interest of maintaining peace, the government says you can't debate with each other anymore. You need to stick to your own, focus on your own texts, and also help the government keep track of any rebellious groups, whether they be Pure Land, Nichiren, or Christians in Japan. Okay. So from that point on, people had kind of a default identity, whether it's Soto Zen, Kyoto Shinshu, Ingon Tendai, Nichiren, etc. Okay. Whereas before this, you certainly have lineages. You have regional cultic centers, like let's say Mount Koya or the Honganji complex and so on, Mount Hiei, but you also have a lot of overlap. So one of the things that I like to do is kind of lay out, like you would see in a Japanese encyclopedia, all of the places that these different monks go to train and meditate and study. So, you'll have, one monk, like let's say Kakuban. Kakuban is someone who lives a couple centuries before Dohan, who I work on in the 1200s. And Kakuban studies Yogacara, he studies Madhyamaka, he studies esoteric lineages in what we would now call the Shingon tradition, as well as what we would now call the Tendai tradition. As well, he's part of this Kukai studies revival, where Kukai is becoming known as this great doctrinal figure, as well as a bodhisattva-like figure for devotion. So you line it all up, and it's like, okay, what category does he fit in? If all of the categories are relevant to his education. There's another example, the temple Zenrinji, also known as Eikando. Eikando is founded by one of the disciples of Kukai, so it's sometimes categorized as a Shingon temple. It's at the foot of Mount Hiei, so there's a lot of Tendai guys hanging out there too. It's administered by the Tonan-in of the Todaiji temple, so it has this Madhyamaka stream as well. And nowadays, it's part of the Jodoshu, or the Pure Land school. So which category does it fit in? So when you study the pre-modern traditions of Japan, or the rest of East Asia for that matter, that's what it looks like, is a little bit of everything overlapping with everything else. But the problem is that the framework we're using to study the pre-modern traditions is based in modern Japan, where sectarianism matters. So it's like, I sometimes say that scholars are often the types of people who don't like their food to touch. And I think priests are like this as well. So you have your peas and carrots and potatoes and everything is separate. But the real world is much more mixed up. And Buddhism and the rest of East Asia today and pre-modern Japan is much more mixed up, right? So in Japan before 1600, or even in, let's say, contemporary Vietnam, you could have a Chan lineage, practice certain mantras of the esoteric tradition, be interested in studying the Tiantai texts of Master Zhi Yi, and aspire for rebirth in the Pure Land later on in life. And all of that makes sense together. You could be devoted to Manjushri and Avalokiteshvara and Amitabha and whatever your local regional saint or important cultural figure, and all of that works just fine. So that's something that we often miss when we're relying on like modern or contemporary sectarianism. It's helpful for outlining an essay or a book, but it's not that helpful for looking at lived practice. And the other thing is that even in contemporary Japan, these categories are often very fluid. So you'll see somebody at one temple, but they're wearing accoutrement of another sect or institution. So again, these boundaries are very fluid.
So it's like a little bit like I know it from the Tibetan traditions where you have it actually often there's talk about the schools.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look within the schools, like as a sort of a bucket, it
Sure.
contains lineages, and
Mm-hmm.
you might be in one school, but actually your
Mm-hmm.
preferred practice lineage is almost lapping
Yeah.
into another school.
Yeah.
Like,
And
and
then whatever your area of specialization might be, that might change over the course of your career, right?
exactly, like Gelugpa Lama might start out with the classic Madhyamaka way and Tsongkhapa's
Mm,
teaching, and he might end up become a sort of Dzogchen practitioner, which you would associate with the Nyingma school.
sure.
And he might run into trouble for doing that or not.
Mm. Oh, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, but it always depends if it's viewed from the point of view of the institutions
Mm-hmm.
and
Yes.
or from the point of view of the traditions or practice lineages. And there have been attempts in Tibet that they are kind of were trying to give more importance to the lineages of practice and the
Mm,
successions of the
interesting.
tradition being handed down from one
Mm-hmm.
master to the other, rather than the fashion of being included into one school,
Mm-hmm.
being kind of like having a membership or being in a
Yeah.
party and
Yeah.
having
Yeah.
to swear your allegiance
Yeah.
to your
That's right.
institution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So these overlaps happen quite often, and as I see when we come back to what I said before, to Amitabha practices, I see this
Yeah.
very often because in the Tibetan schools, nobody really has a trademark on Amitabha practice.
Exactly.
In
Yep.
these sutras, they are generally in the foundation of all schools.
Mm-hmm.
Then you would have different practices from different tantras, and you could say that some of the revealed treasure transmissions of Buddha, practices of Buddha Amitabha would pertain more to the Nyingma schools,
I
the
see.
different ones,
Uh-huh.
but then they're also practiced by the Kagyupa schools. And because
Mm.
the transference of consciousness, Powa, is so omnipresent, it might be very well practiced, at least within the Sakya school. I'm not sure if the Gelugpa school is
Mm.
totally open to it, but one might also dig into that and find they're doing it as well.
So, in the case of East Asian Buddhism, you'll sometimes hear people talking about the syncretism
Hmm.
of Zen or Chan or Son and Pure Land. So, as if you're taking these two distinct things
Hmm.
and smushing them together. But you can't syncretize two things that are not actually separate. So, for example, Robert Sharf has a great article on this on the Chan Pure Land thing. So, Pure Land, as as you've noticed in the Tibetan tradition as well, Pure Land is just part of the picture when it comes to Mahayana Buddhism. It's a cosmological assumption. It's a soteriological goal. It is practiced in from various perspectives in various different lineages. And if Zen is then an emergent discourse within the Mahayana, then that's just part of the picture. When they critique certain perspectives on the nature of Amitabha name recitation, they're not saying don't do it. They're saying understand it more deeply. And what I figured out is that that's the same thing that's going on in the esoteric traditions. So one classic example is from the monk Amoghavajra, who is often seen as kind of the watermark for the esoteric lineage consciousness in Tong China. And one of the cool texts that he produces that I think would be very familiar to someone coming from a Tibetan tradition, it's Wuliang Shou Igwe, and Muryo Jogiki. It looks like a deity yoga text, like a sadhana that you would look at. Like, oh, I know what this is. It's very similar, right? You have a lotus blossom, a moon disk, Sanskrit syllables that appear and transform into deities back and forth. Amitabha becomes Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara becomes Amitabha. It's a whole tantric thing. Well, this interesting text, because it has kind of a standard tantric yoga template, is actually still used as one of the default texts for ritual training. In Shingon and Tendai lineages, it kind of the template that the current esoteric initiation system is built on is this text, as well as a handful of others that have a similar format for visualization and practice and purification and mantra and Dharani practice. And one of the things I've always found interesting with the tantric texts is that they're highly customizable, that they, if you happen to really love Avalokiteshvara, well, that's who you can build the ritual around, or Amitabha, or the medicine Buddha, or whoever. And there's kind of a like plug and play. You take one out, you put one in, it can grow, it
Hmm.
can be longer, it can be shorter. And there's this interesting scholar, Hayami Tasuku, whose work was really helpful for me as I was formulating my dissertation and then my book. And he critiqued this idea. There's this kind of triumphalistic, Protestant approach to the study of Pure Land that says that Pure Land represents the rejection of esoteric Buddhism. Well, Hayami is saying that it's the opposite, that esoteric Buddhism lays the foundation that the Pure Land traditions are able to develop out of. Because there's this customization. If you're really into Amitabha Buddha, you can develop a ritual practice that's exclusively focused on that, right? If you take the name of the Buddha, Namo Amida Butsu, and envision it as a dharani or mantra where each syllable can be, expounded upon infinitely, you've now made an argument that this short syllable can contain within it the whole of the Buddha Dharma. And this taps into Tiantai interconnectedness as well as Huayan thought, esoteric thought of Buddhahood and embodiment, and so on. And then that is then the foundation that these so-called Pure Land schools develop, where they say exclusive devotion, exclusive practice, and you have centuries of academic argument within the Buddhist world saying, yeah, we can do that. The key difference with the medieval Pure Land schools, and this is an interesting thing that happens in Japan, 11, 1200s, is the shift from a comprehensive esoteric, exoteric system. We have the sutras, the tantras, all this stuff, to this exclusive single practice approach. Interestingly, though, that single practice approach is rooted in Shingon esoteric Buddhism, Tendai, Hongaku, original Enlightenment thought, and so forth and so on. I'm learning more about the potential influence of Zen because it's during the Song Dynasty, so Zen influence on broader East Asian Buddhism as well. So then people make the argument is all you need is the name of Amitabha, or all you need is the title of the Lotus Sutra, or all you need is a moment of faith, or sitting in zazen. And so like the theoretical work has already been done, then that leads to this reformation focused on single practices. So it's a departure, but it's a departure that is, kind of intellectually based on all this other, probably very familiar tantric stuff that had been going on in Japan for a long time.
Yeah. But of course, this might include the danger at a certain point where you, instead of pointing towards one thing being the essence of everything and everything unveiling that
Yeah,
you have studied before and you're kind of, I don't think necessarily one has to be an accomplished scholar or an accomplished meditator, but there's nevertheless a structure of learning, a swamp
sure.
that the
Yeah,
flower can grow out from. But
right.
if the swamp isn't there,
Hmm.
it might turn
Sure.
out to be a pretty plasticky flower.
That that's a really interesting point. And I have had over the last 2 or 3 semesters, I've had some really fun conversations with students about this issue exactly. Like in my intro to Buddhism class, we've gone through, India, we've covered from, the teaching of the Buddha through Tantra, we've covered China, we've covered Korea. Now we're to Japan and we have these single practice schools. And so much of the conversation in China and Korea is about comprehensiveness. So much of the conversation in Japan as well is trying to emulate what's going on in Korea or China. And then we have these single practice schools. So I asked, what last year, the class was about 50-50. 50% were like, nope, we like the comprehensive view, not this limited thing. Then others say, no, I like being able to focus on one thing, like that, that vibes, that makes sense to me
Yeah.
in some way. And then hearing their different arguments, they're all valid arguments, and they disagree. And that becomes a really fruitful conversation for them. And then I learn a lot about kind of what resonates with people and what draws them in. Who knows? Like your views may change over time. Like I remember when I was much younger, I was very compelled by aniconic practice. So, think like kind of an
Mhm.
American Zen. I don't need these books. I don't need these images. I've just got this practice, right? Like that was my view at like maybe age 20. But like now, dealing with young people at university, dealing with my own children or other people's children in Dharma school, seeing how ritual and songs and food and all this other stuff contributes to this vibrant life in the Dharma, I think it opens the conversation to saying that one approach isn't necessary for everybody.
Yeah, and I think isn't there a kind of approaches and retractions? I think
Mm-hmm.
also with generations, I definitely be classified as Generation X. So we like
Mm.
rejected was before. The generation of my parents, they would embrace other cultures because they were tired of their own culture, the
True.
rigidity. So
Yeah.
they really try to emulate. And I think the Tibetan Buddhist scene that I came into when I was young was very much that. People
Mm-hmm.
were
Mm-hmm.
like 10, 20 years older and they try to be Tibetan. They try to
Sure.
like
Sure.
live the tradition and depart from their own. And I think in my generation, it was a big move to say, okay, but first, it doesn't work
Mm-hmm.
entirely because a culture can never really be, it can never
Sure.
really be yours. You can't really
No. No.
swim like a fish. You always become
That's right.
like you
That's
want to
right.
be a fish, but
Sure.
you're also
I,
never really in it to the same degree. And
mm-hmm.
then there were these kind of movements, almost I would say a Protestant
Mm-hmm.
Buddhist movement that
Sure.
were
Sure.
like trying to strip everything away. Yeah, that was groovy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. I was just talking with someone who had grown up Catholic, and then their experience of Protestantism was like, you're just, your rejection of Catholicism is just getting rid of all the fun stuff. I thought that was
Yeah.
a really funny observation. Like, we can keep some of the stuff, like one of the things that inspired me to really focus some energy on Dharma school for my own kids, as well as, friends in the community who are interested in exploring the Dharma, is that I realized that I will always speak Buddhism with an accent, right? Like learning a language as an adult, you learn a new tradition as an adult, you'll always have an accent, right? My accent is particularly Southern, possibly slightly. A friend of mine told me, "Oh, you went from Baptist, you just changed some words, and now you're Pure Land." I'm like, no, that's not it. I get the joke, but no, that's not quite right. But I'll always speak it with a kind of an accent, right? So I also like that you brought up the Gen X thing. Like I guess culturally, I identify as Gen X, but technically I'm an older millennial. So I think there's another thing, Zennial. It's like right in the middle. I don't know
Yeah.
what to do with that. In case, when I began meditating, I began studying Buddhism, as a young teenager. Then I went to Boulder, Colorado, which is, is where Naropa is, and a lot of, very dedicated practitioners. But for me, culturally, coming from rural Tennessee, there's a lot about that just didn't fit for me, right? My first day in Colorado, I'm like, man, I'm feeling homesick. I just said hi to somebody, and they just, I said howdy, nobody, and they didn't even say hi back. I go to the store, I'm looking for sweet tea, and they're like, "We have peach. Does that work?" I'm like, "No, that's not right." So, and then I'm encountering this Buddhism that is very, it's tofu and green tea, and don't get me wrong, I love all of those things, but like culturally, it didn't quite fit. I also encountered a lot of elitism, and I saw plenty of that in the Christian South, like where you're using your religion as a way of well, my prayer beads are like this, or my meditation cushion is organic, or it's like a lot of that type thing. I'm like, that's not my vibe. I'm not feeling that. And then I went to be an English teacher in Japan. It was about 20 years ago, to 2020, 2005, and my friends were that they like to party, they like to drink beer, they like to eat all kinds of delicious food, including snapping turtle and fried chicken. And I'm like, okay, I can understand this, right? But then also having very robust, dynamic, vibrant family life around the Dharma. And I was like, this is what I want. For me, I'm much more civilized now, but for me at 23, being able to sit and have a smoke and drink a beer with the priest, like that fit for me. And that was a Dharma gate that made sense to me in some way. The other thing that time that really got my attention is just the idea of the bodhisattva as aspiring to save all beings. So not like what I grew up with down south, where it's the right race, the right religion, the right sexual orientation, the right social class or whatever. The Bodhisattva vows to save all beings. The thing that was interesting to me about Pure Land, and initially I as well, I had no idea. I arrived in Japan. I'm looking for a Zen temple because that's what I'm into, and there's no Zen temples in the part of Western Japan where I lived. And there's all these Pure Land temples. And then okay, what is that? And I learned, oh, wow, this is the largest form of Buddhism in Japan. I learned about Pure Land as an aspect of Mahayana practice. I'm like, wow, this is maybe the largest, one of the most prevalent forms of Buddhist practice in the world. And I've been reading about this stuff for over 10 years now. Why have I never heard of it? Why do I know so little about this? So part of my, both in my personal practice, but also in my academic curiosity, was trying to understand what historical factors made that the case. What is it about Pure Land that people have missed or misunderstood? Then I started learning about it. And one of the things that really jumped out to me is this question that Honen asked. So Honen is regarded as kind of the founder of the Pure Land tradition. He's the teacher of Shinran. And when Shinran is talking about his practice, he's not presenting himself as a founder. Shinran presents himself as Honen's student. So he's really invested in Honen's argument. And what Honen presents in one of his texts is if Buddha reality represents this perfect compassion, and the Bodhisattva path is about this compassion for all beings, which is a better representative of that compassion? An elite practice that requires 3 PhDs and a bunch of gold and slaves and all this stuff to accomplish, or a practice that anybody can do? At 20, I found that to be a compelling argument. That's something that I've been trying to learn more about. And the other thing, like, is there's something about chanting in community that just clicked for me. As voices coalesce, the room, your body is vibrating at this frequency. Just, I don't mean frequency as like some abstract cosmic thing, but like a literal, like your body in space with people, that feeling. There's something kind of magical about that. And I feel like part of what has driven my academic interest is trying to understand why that works for people, why that is so attractive. I read this dissertation recently from a scholar at Hiroshima University, and he had this whole chapter on neuroscience. So it's funny. I'm like reading about medieval Japan. I'm fine with that. I get to this chapter on neuroscience. I'm like, oh, I must have missed that day in Japanese class because I don't understand
Yeah.
any of this. But he's talking about like, why is chanting a thing that has certain physiological effects on the body and in the mind? And I think of it very much kind of in the social aspect, like being in a room with people and your voice is harmonizing. There's something kind of beautiful in that. And
Yeah, and I think it's one of these many things that maybe at a certain point one can also scientifically pinpoint it.
yeah,
But especially when you come from the field of Buddhist studies, it's one
yeah,
of these fields that are left alone because you
yeah,
can't really clue it down. But it's so important. to
Sure.
the craft of Buddhist practice.
That's right.
Like I remember when I was like 20 years old, I was seeing this Tibetan Lama and I had this idea, let's meditate together, sit together. He looked at me and said, like, you dumb? What shit? You can sit anytime. You don't need me for sitting.
Yeah.
He said, when we're together, we do a ritual. Then we can join force. We can do something.
Yeah. Yeah.
When we aren't doing anything, when you don't want to do anything, go to your room. Be free, you
That's
know?
great.
And this has a certain, you can say, magic aspect that brings people together on a level that is not conjured up by ideas, by
Sure.
a certain technique, and also not by the contents of the communication.
Yeah.
Like you might do your practice and think one thing,
Hmm.
and I might do my practice and think another thing. But nevertheless, by engaging in the same stream of practice, there's some kind of harmonization
That's right.
that happens that is not bound on like being of the same idea, of the same
Yep.
thought, not even by liking one another.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the best chanting teachers I ever met was not someone I liked all that much, but I was like, wow, he's
Yeah.
really good at this. The point you make as well goes back to your earlier comment about how different people are going to understand the Pure Land, the Buddha Amitabha in perhaps radically different ways. But in the context of practice, it doesn't matter, right? And this goes back to the earliest, identifiable evidence of the Mahayana, most likely, is that people believe different stuff, but belief is not so important, right? This is not, the Reformation era Europe. This is, ancient India or ancient Japan or China or whatever. So there's all these different beliefs, but practice and the experiences you have in these practice contexts, the communities you build through practice, much more important, And I think that, what we talked earlier about Protestant Buddhism. I think that for many, we are speaking English. And I tell my students like the university I teach is very, very diverse. But I say, listen, if we're in this room speaking English together in North America, we're likely influenced by Protestant culture, and that's going to make us think that belief is paramount. When really, there's all this other stuff that could be important as well. And you know, I really like the doctrinal aspect of things. I've done a lot of different work with like curricular design and teaching about doctrine and doctrinal systems and classification systems. I enjoy that stuff. But when it comes to like the life of the Dharma, there's something about being together and sharing in one voice. That there are all these ways that kind of the ordinary stuff of Dharma practice is actually where the really cool ideas come to life. So it's not just an abstraction, a book on the shelf. It's in community with your children, with your mother, whoever. Like it's really powerful that way.
That's like some point I often think overseen when I remember long before academia, I started out as a practitioner
Mm,
and I was in this Buddhist center driving a lama to his friend and we're driving along this long road and it
mm,
was can say an overland road, really straight, nothing to do. And at a certain
mm,
point, a car sheared out on my driveway and I thought, that's it, you know,
mm,
like we were going like 100 kilometers per hour, something like this. And well, there was a big crash and I suddenly awoke and I could not fathom what had happened, but I thought this might be it.
mm,
I might be in a situation where I don't have much time anymore. And there was this prayer to Buddha Amitabha
mm.
that we had always been doing before ending the prayer session. I thought I don't think I'm at a point where I should rely on anything else. So I
Mm.
did
I
this
like that.
prayer and kind of drifted away. Then they revived me and I had another shot at this life. But
Wow, that's
this
amazing.
was one of the most important Amitabha moments in my life.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, in my tradition, to that we would say Namo Amida. Yeah. I had a student who told me who had a similar experience that then began their journey in Shin Buddhism. Okay, so this is a student of mine from Egypt who had struggled with their Muslim faith as a gay man. And in my classes, they had a lot of questions about that sort of thing. And they would share some really interesting observations about similarities and differences between Buddhist culture and Muslim culture and so on. And one day in class, I mentioned this monk whose name I'm forgetting, but he wrote this popular book called "This Monk Wears Heels." He's a Jodo Shu monk who is also a makeup artist and very into kind of playing with masculine, feminine clothing style and things. Very interesting guy. He's like, wait a minute, you can do that? And I was like, yeah. Like the student also ran a drag show in town. He's a cool guy. So anyway, he was almost in a car wreck. And he told me about this later, and it's like some thing, he didn't have an accident, but like he was suddenly this moment, and what came out of his mouth organically, naturally, was Namo Amida Butsu, calling to Amitabha Buddha. So he had this moment of like, wow, what was that? Why is that what came out? So he wanted to learn more about it, like he learned
Yeah.
a little bit in class, but then had this moment of crisis. And this reminds me of an experience that I had when I first moved to Japan. I was lonely and alone in a way that I had never been in my life. In college, I had a cool house. We played rock and roll in the living room, had a cool girlfriend. She's not my wife now, actually, but like I was suddenly by myself. I didn't have anybody to even speak English with. I hadn't even started working yet. I was just like alone. And so, I'm feeling kind of anxious about it and, being in the middle of nowhere. So I start meditating. And meditating is one of those things that can be really good for when you're feeling anxious. But in this case, it just dialed up the temperature. And I
Oh,
was like,
yeah.
way worse. It's like, what else do I have? Like, what other resources do I have? And I was like, oh yeah, there's some Amida thing, right? So I started chanting, and that breath control or whatever you call it, I guess dialed it back down again. I was like, oh, that's interesting. What is that? And then, as it turns out, the part of Japan I lived in Eastern Japan, is you throw a rock and you'll hit a Soto Zen temple. In Western Japan, the joke is you throw a rock and you will hit a Jodo Shinshu temple. So then that's what I had in my environment to help me.
Yeah, actually, the Tibetan tradition also in when you come to the tantric traditions where you have the mantra practice and so forth, then of course the relation between breath, mind movement, and the mantra's influence is often credited. Mantra is then quite often not only seeing as an approach to the deity on the level like you repeat it many times and the closer you get, but at the
Sure,
same time as one of your shamatha stablemate to
sure,
actually rely upon to focus the mind or to calm the mind by having the thoughts cease to a greater extent as if just like trying to be there, trying to breathe. Also, sometimes doing something I think is really helpful. One might end up too cerebral,
that's right.
especially when you have scholarship about meditation. It might end up very cerebral because it's thought to be about mind, and
Mm-hmm.
the division of the thinking mind and the division of the resting mind is not always clear. And the thinking mind doesn't foster or doesn't bring forth the resting mind.
That's right. Yeah. I just saw a minister remind somebody of that because we were doing meditation, and one of the Sangha members, the priest would read a piece of the words of Buddha, and then if anything comes up kind of organically, kind of personal reflection type thing, let something naturally come out, not to engage, being able to make that distinction. And I said, I'm a PhD student, and she said, oh, you don't sit today. Here's the broom, go sweep, right? You need something physically embodied, because I
Yeah,
know that if you sit down, you're just going to start cogitating. You're going to start,
yeah.
thinking. Stop that. Like you can just sit or you can just sweep. So go sweep. So it was a great first day. I was like, all right, well, I'm in the lobby. I don't have anything to sweep, but I'm going to keep sweeping. It was perfect. It was just what I needed. She figured me out right away.
Yeah. It's part of the translation of Buddhism.
Sure.
It's a very narrow side to say translation is what you do on paper or on
Mm-hmm.
screen. You can
Yeah,
read.
yeah,
The doing has to be translated as well, and the experience has to be translated.
sure.
Also, like you said before, it's the dance, it's the song, it's the working, it's the
Mm-hmm.
view in the daily chores,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
and it's the mind states. And I feel there's a transmission for that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Yeah.
transmission is the basis for the translation. I was sitting in a public lecture of a Tibetan teacher, and he said he went to the story of Nagarjuna burying or unveiling the buried text from the Nagas.
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
that this wouldn't work. He said, this is nobody can believe this, he said.
Mm-hmm.
I say, yes, but most of the Dharma transmissions are based on that. And actually, it
That's
takes you
right.
to a different realm. Not a
Mm-hmm.
physical realm, but it takes you to an idea that you can exactly not pinpoint it to human
Mm-hmm.
events. Because
That's right.
you go down a rabbit hole if you try to pinpoint Buddhist
Mm-hmm.
transmission
That's
to
right.
one person that you can locate. If you
Mm-hmm.
take any
Mm-hmm.
kind of Indian or Tibetan teacher, if you look at their biographies, at first everything looks very clear, and then you see, well,
Mm-hmm.
it's written like 500, 800 years later. If you
Sure.
go
Sure.
back further, you find less and less. It becomes more and more um, destabilizing. And I remember
Mm-hmm.
that a friend of mine said, yeah, this Milarepa, you know, I've heard all these stories and I believed them. And then I read this book, which kind of an analysis of his biographies, and nothing is true. But it's also because things are revived in the present, and the
That's right.
story is not necessarily to be tangible.
Mm-hmm.
It's also
Yeah.
to invoke a sentiment or to invoke a devotion in the practitioners. It's just a support for that, and the stories can change because
That's right.
people change.
That's right. And even throughout your life as well, the thing that you vibed with at age 20 may be different at 40 or 50 or whatever, and that's part of the process. So one of the other classes I teach is a Lotus Sutra seminar where we read the text very intensely, like a good textual analysis style. And this is something I've been reading since my late teens, and the way that I respond to it now is very different. That's the great things about religious literature or just any kind of literature is you keep coming back to it and learning new things because the self is not a stable thing. It's
Mhm.
always changing. So the self that's encountering the text is changing just as the text is always changing depending on who is engaging with it. We talk about like negotiating or wrestling with the text, trying to understand what did the early audience maybe mean by X, Y, and Z, but also how does it resonate today? And that's in one of Don Lopez's books on the Lotus Sutra. He talks about how rigorous engagement with the text is one way to really honor a text. And I also remember something that John McRae, late scholar of Chinese Buddhism, and Jan Natye both say is that if we think of Buddhism as to see the world as it truly is, and we see Buddhist studies as to see Buddhism as it truly is, and then those goals can overlap in some really interesting ways.
I think that's absolutely true. It's kind of you sometimes start to wrestle with the text. It can be very different, like classical scenario, of course, is
Mm-hmm.
like when you work on a PhD thesis, because one is still very early and one's path on dealing with text, one's still trying to like get the tools at hand.
That's right. That's
And
right.
and there was an initial motivation to get into this particular
Mm-hmm.
text. But
Yeah.
then this motivation or the goal might have been served at like the first third or at
Mm-hmm.
half
Mm-hmm.
time.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
still have to do it, and you still have
Yeah.
to unravel all of the text, and it can be just for the project, but you can also discover many more things. I think like these huge sutras, they are so all encompassing in a way. The scenario with these different realms, so many ideas play into that that maybe isn't even or that aren't the environment that the sutra is presented as being, this
Sure.
Mahaparinirvana Sutra would be the sutra explaining the nirvana of the Buddha and this having as a context. But there are so many different aspects or tranches of the cake that come
Mm-hmm.
along with it. So it doesn't never stop.
That's right. That's right. And I really like your point about the nagas and the aspects of transmission that seem to put you in a different realm, or you might say a different headspace. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think about, so we've got, the Prajna Paramita, we've got, Nagarjuna, we've got Vasubandhu and Asanga receiving transmission. We've got the treasure texts in the Tibetan tradition and so forth and so on. There's all this, the idea of esotericism itself as a way of expressing that these texts are coming from something beyond. in the Shingon tradition, and by the way, so the word Shingon can refer to a single sect of Japanese Buddhism today, but it can also refer to kind of esoteric Buddhism more broadly. And so Tendai monks might refer to themselves as Shingon monks because they're specialists in
Hmm.
the tantras. And there's one of the transmission lineages that essentially bypasses Shakyamuni. It's Mahavarochana to Vajrasattva to Nagarjuna and a couple more, and then it gets to China, right? So,
Mm.
we look at us. I ask my students, like, who's missing from this chart? And it was the Buddha. Where's the Buddha? I'm like, but it's all the Buddha. It's this other conversation where it's saying that what we experience as Shakyamuni's teaching is Mahavarochana manifesting as this accommodated means, the exoteric teachings for beings, but it's also this claim these teachings are coming from beyond, right? And what I have found interesting in the Shingon tradition is how often that is framed as embodied, that we're not really just talking about some metaphysical other thing, but also the human body as this profound tool and resource for transformation, for enlightenment, and so on. One of the cool images that shows up in the text that I worked on, you were talking about how the process of the dissertation or the translation is how you acquire these skills. Well, for my dissertation, I did the first chapter of this book. Then for my book that was recently published, I did the other two chapters. I didn't know how much Yogacara was in the middle chapter until I was actually translating it. It was hard, right? My advisor at Koyasan University had said he was working on a Japanese translation of this text, because all this stuff is written in classical Chinese, but he quit because it was too hard. There was just too much weird
Hmm.
stuff in there. And then I'm sitting there with a half finished half of a chapter. I'm like, wait, who am I to try this? If he says this thing is too hard, and he's right, it was too hard. It was
Hmm.
not a fun thing to do. But but it's out there and it's more or less complete. But you acquire these skills and so on. But also like through engaging with these texts, and you think about these great practitioners in the past who it's like their full-time job is deconstructing the nature of consciousness or thinking about the body, right? And if they talk about these other realms, that's a really effective way, I think, to talk about how transformative these practices can be. Whether you believe them to be literal places or not is kind of beside the point.
Interacting with Tibetan teachers, I saw that the two can very well coexist, which for my German mind often is almost impossible.
Oh,
But
sure, sure.
one thing is the setting, it's totally true, and there's absolutely no problem that a vast number of arhats and bodhisattvas was sitting on the Vulture Peak. While obviously, if you go onto Vulture Peak, you see that there's barely space for 20 people.
Sure. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but at the same time, that this nevertheless is like an outer worldly experience or
Mm-hmm.
a transcendent experience that is kind of leading the mind into a setting where there's much more openness, much more space for concepts to fall away, you could say.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I was always really intrigued by the ability of Tibetans or Tibetan lamas to have these two coexist.
We like our boxes. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so like the same idea of like different or one Nagarjuna and many Nagarjunas. Yeah,
I
he
like the
lived 500
Nagarjuna.
years.
Yeah, I like the Nagarjuna, who's a deconstructionist philosopher, hanging out with dragons, a spell master. He goes to the Pure Land and then has his own Pure Land, which like that'd be a great study abroad opportunity.
Yeah.
Like I love all the stuff, and I like holding it together, right? Because I think that there's a lot of fun. Like to put it so, there's a lot of fun that is missed if you don't have that stuff around. We're not just consciousness floating around in the universe. We're embodied beings with families and friends and all this stuff. One of the concepts in Shin that is in Jodo Shinshu or Shin Buddhism is really emphasized is focusing on all of the beings and things that you might not even know about that support your practice, that support your ability at all to encounter this stuff. So when you think about Vulture Peak as this tiny place, or like Vimalakirti's living room or whatever, as this little space, but then everything is there, right? And it reminds one of interconnectedness concepts in like Tiantai or Huayan or dependent arising, nirvana and samsara as being one, all things depending upon all other things. The thing in Shin Buddhism is a lot of people will say we don't have a practice, or they'll say a practice that is a non-practice. Okay, you go back to the early Chinese thinker Tan Luan. Tan Luan's a great kind of synthesizer of Madhyamaka, Yogacara, Prajnaparamita, then articulating it through Pure Land. He talks about going to the Pure Land as a non-going, right? Or we talk about the
Mhm.
self as a non-self. So it's like Buddhists like to take these concepts that we want to have and then mess with them, just twist it a little bit, or kind of taking what you think you want from this concept or this idea, going to the Pure Land, having a self, having a practice. It's like, well, let's adjust that a little bit, right? So that the practice, it's received. It's not my practice. I'm being a good Buddhist. It's something that you are called to. Sometimes the call is coming from within the house, as they say. The call is coming from within. It's coming from without, and sometimes the emphasis is then placed on, yeah. But with all these ideas kind of connecting in, the idea is focused on gratitude. That what the practice becomes is just opening oneself to this gratitude for all the things that we receive. So when we're practicing, we'll take, let's say here, the collected works of Shinran. And when you pick up the book, first thing is to receive, right? And the term you use for this act of receiving is itadaku, which just means receive. It's just one of the verbs to receive. But also in Japan, when you are sitting down for a meal with anybody, you're at a restaurant with friends, family, your grandma brings you something, palms together and say itadakimasu. The same word means to receive, like I am receiving, and it has, like you know, uh, goodbye originally meaning God be with ye.
Mhm.
People don't often think about that. When you say goodbye, you're not making a theological declaration. In Japan, same thing. You say itadakimasu, you're not making a theological statement, but it has this connection to this idea of receiving, not just the person who made the meal for you, but all the causes and conditions that have to come together for that meal to exist at all.
Mhm.
In my interview with Tricycle, I was talking about this orange farmer, this Mandarin orange farmer, mikan in Japanese. It was my friend's employee's brother, and they started bringing me crates of oranges. So like, for the rest of the year, I never had to buy any oranges. So then you talk about all the causes and conditions. I'm receiving this person's generosity. Oranges are often things that show up on the altar and whatnot. So it's this constant reminder of, how we subsist through the generosity of so many others that we may not even acknowledge or know about, but they're there, right? So then for Shin Buddhists, I guess often our non-practice is this recognition of mutual dependence, mutual aid, and just gratitude for all those things, right? And of course, that can be understood in a variety of different ways, whether it be a kind of humanist perspective or an abstract metaphysical perspective or whatever. And that diversity or elasticity is something I think is really interesting.
You often have this in general Buddhist practice that you have a paradox. Instead of taking, you receive. Instead of doing a practice, you let the practice unfold. Instead of being something, you unbe or you
Sure.
become undone.
Yeah.
And I think the way I always perceive practice worked is that it all boils down to a core of generating faith in not having to
Mhm.
do it yourself, not having to make it happen.
Right.
With all the doing one does,
That's
but
right. That's
I
right.
think
Yeah.
it comes down to all the doing is the unraveling of the tendencies of
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
vasanas that are there that force
Hmm.
oneself to do and to work and to strive
Hmm.
and to struggle. But in the same way, true practice always comes about more by itself, more
Hmm. Right.
naturally, and the more unnatural it is, the less practice will happen, the less happy it will make.
That's right.
Kind of,
Yeah.
there's this kind of
Yeah.
correlation, and from the traditions I know, that Dzogchen tradition, you have like Magom Sangye, the Buddha without meditation.
Mm.
That Buddhahood is actually not coming from meditation, but it's ever present. Or
That's right. That's right.
you have many of these words, uncontrived,
Hmm.
unfabricated. This
Yeah.
Dzogchen tradition, this is very prevalent
Hmm. Hmm.
also.
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, one of the things that I have found really interesting in the tantric traditions is this focus on embodiment, right? That it's not some other thing far away, but it's, as you said, ever present. And in some sense, physical. That's one of the things that I've enjoyed with some of the medieval Japanese texts is that there is this focus on the physical world, So you'll sometimes hear about the Buddhahood of grasses and trees and mountains and rivers, or it's some phrase like that. So that it becomes about the mind and body is being integrated, the self and the world is being integrated, and enlightenment being like a core dimension of that, or that which is constituting all of this, right? I know there are some people right now that are getting really excited about the idea of panpsychism. I've had a few people ask me to talk about that a little bit. I don't know how useful that is as a term, but just the physicality of practice. And I think that especially those of us like myself who have first encountered Buddhism through books or through kind of abstract ideas apart from community, that physicality is easy to lose. Not only because we have certain cultural prejudices in that direction, but also because often that's how we're encountering the tradition to begin with. And that's an important thing to break down. And
Physicality also might lead to an exhaustion of concepts or to an exhaustion of the possibility to create further concepts.
sure,
I
sure.
mean, there are practices that actually are meant to exhaust the mind by physically exhausting.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um, but
Um,
also you could take your bike and go 100 miles and
that's right.
there won't be, if you in a meditative context, I think, then you might also
Yeah,
have very few concepts.
absolutely. Yeah, it's a great feeling.
Yeah.
Speaking of exhaustion, I have a funny story from this Pure Land temple in Tokyo. So this is Zojoji. It's the temple associated with the Tokugawa family. Also, like 10 years ago or so, there was some Marvel movie called, I think, The Wolverine, and Wolverine is fighting some Yakuza ninjas in this temple. So anyway, so I'm in this temple. There's no Wolverines, there's no Yakuza ninjas. It's just me and a bunch of monks. And I wanted to just observe. Again, I've got my elbow patches on, my blazer, and I got my notebook, and I'm sitting on the sidelines as the monks are beginning to line up, and it was open for lay practice, but I just wanted to observe. This very large monk comes up to me and says, "You can either participate or you can leave." It's very straightforward. Like, all right, I'll see what I can do. Right. So I'm not dressed for, nor am I trained for this type of activity. It was full prostrations while chanting, and either one of those I think would be exhausting enough. But just so doing this for however long this was, an hour, maybe more, it felt like an eternity. And at this one point, there's the golden Buddha and the golden wall behind it, and it starts to I'm getting tunnel vision, like the sparkly purple and gold. I'm like, well, this is how I go. This is not a bad way to go. But it was like, it put me in this altered state of consciousness for sure. I was sore from my shoulders down for like a week. It was very physically intense, but also, the breath control, and banging on the wooden fish for a little bit, doing all this stuff. That physical aspect, I think, it can be missed if all our practice is just sitting quietly. There's all this other stuff to do as well.
But you did this for a week or?
No, I was sore for a week. I did it for
Ah,
one
you
day.
were sore for a week because the Tibetan traditions, they have, maybe you know this called non-draw preliminary practices.
Okay, sure, sure.
And you do 100,000 prostrations. And
Hmm.
if this is done in retreat, it can be between 2,000 and 4,000 prostrations every
Sure,
day,
sure. Yep,
which
absolutely.
mean one very quickly passes beyond soreness.
Hmm. Yeah, yes, absolutely. So, um, but we were talking a moment ago about practices being automatic, and there are other things like this, like whether you're chanting to memorize stuff. So right now I'm working towards ordination, which means I have to do a lot of
Mhm.
chanting practice. So in October I'll go to Japan, shave my head and my beard, and kind of take some tests and have this 10-day grueling schedule. And a big part of it reminds me of learning guitar songs, because you play until it's like your hands know it, where it's not no
Yeah,
longer about memorization. It's just becomes this automatic thing. One line naturally calls forth the other line, and it just
yeah.
kind of goes like that. And so again, it breaks down this mind body division. It breaks down this self and other division. One of the things that many people who have gone through this practice to receive ordination have emphasized is that you go in kind of thinking you're the expert, but you come out realizing how much you depend upon your teammates, the people that are in your group for training. And many of the ministers I've talked to say, without my fellow trainees, I couldn't have finished. Like I wouldn't have been able to do it without them. I think that's also part of the intensity of some of these practices, is that you become open to like the cracks start to show, and then you can see, oh
Yeah,
wow, I depend upon so much that I might not always be aware of, and that's important.
I guess that's the point when you become sort of dangling in the situation,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
like
I like that.
being
Yeah.
not fully in control. I think when you have a shorter exam, you like kind of
Sure.
get your stuff ready, and if you know basically everything, can't be that bad.
Sure.
Except of you have maybe an examiner who really wants to get you down, but
That's
this
right.
almost never happens. So you know
Sure.
you will get, you don't really come out of the exam a changed person. You
Yeah.
just know you passed. But I think these situations, they're transformative in themselves because they deliver you into an, an expanse of no control,
Exactly. Yeah.
where
Yeah.
it's not enough to know everything because you might be too exhausted and not have
That's right.
have
That's right.
the depth to access it. At the same time, you might might be caught on the wrong foot or something.
Sure.
And all these traditions have these kind of
Hmm.
ordeal-like situations.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
May they
Eh,
be crass or actually
That's
very
right.
soft.
That's right. One of the things that I remember is when I first came back to the US, been living in a Shin environment for about a year and was very taken with the tradition, even though feeling like I didn't really understand it all that well. Culturally, I got it. Doctrinally, I was still trying to figure it out. So I
Hmm.
remember this one moment. I'm sitting at the Buddhist church in Denver, or maybe Tri-State Denver Buddhist Temple or something like that. And I've got the copy of Shinran's great text, the Kyogyo Shinsho, and I'm sitting there and I'm trying to read it, and I'm like, wow, I do not understand this. This was 20 years ago. I've now spent a lot of time reading the esoteric stuff and the fun philosophy stuff, and now I can read it, and I feel like I kind of understand it now. I've been doing this reading group for about 2 years now, with some scholars and priests, mostly from the Shin tradition, and kind of hearing everybody's collective wisdom has not only helped me make progress in understanding the text, but also actually finishing it, beginning to end, going through, line by line, really, trying to understand it. Anyway, I feel like I'm getting there. But it's been interesting to me, again, thinking about these, overlapping and interconnected areas of study, is that Shinran Shonin was not preaching to Shin Buddhists. He was preaching to people who were trained in this exoteric, esoteric system where you assume a certain amount of knowledge about Madhyamaka and Yogacara and Tantra, Tiantai, Huayan, the Lotus Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra, is you assume knowledge of this stuff, and then you talk about Amitabha. Knowing a bit of this other stuff actually really helps you be able to understand this tradition that seems so simple. It seems so focused. You say the Nembutsu and don't worry about a whole lot else. Show up to Sangha, bring something nice for the potluck. But if you then understand all this other stuff, then it makes the last line in this text, the Kyogyo Shinsho, is coming from the Avatamsaka Sutra. And these writers are making deliberate choices about what they put where, what they include, what they exclude, how they might parse a sentence to mean one thing or another. But giving the Avatamsaka Sutra the last word got to be significant. So I was talking to one of my colleagues, and he made the argument that if you think about the Avatamsaka Sutra as presenting the 52 bodhisattva stages and all this stuff, the grandeur of the Mahayana tradition, but it's also about interconnectedness. So this thing that seems so simple can actually encompass the whole thing. And also just like the point that made at the end that the bodhisattva vows to save all sentient beings, regardless of they like him or not. Like that's bodhisattva work, whether they're good or not, they like him or not, it doesn't matter.
Mm.
Like bodhisattva's out there doing this work. I feel like I'm beginning to understand this tradition that I'm now pursuing ordination in. I've been trying to think with for about 20 years now. One of the things that I notice sometimes with our single practice traditions, some people take their sectarian identity as the end of the conversation. But the more I read people like Shinran Shonin and others, I really see it as the beginning of the conversation. It gives you your lineage, your teachers, give you a place to stand so you can then explore and learn about the breadth and diversity of the Buddhist tradition. And that I think is really fun. So rather than closing doors at like Avalokiteshvara and the Lotus Sutra is the universal gate. It's the gate to all gates, right?
Yeah.
So it opens up a way for us to learn and explore. And really, if we look at the academic world in Japan, for example, a lot of the people that are studying Vinaya or Tibetan Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism, whatever, a lot of them are actually Shin priests already. That is the kind of their starting point from which they can then explore and all this stuff. I was listening to this interview with Charles Hallisey. I think it was Wisdom Publications, maybe Tricycle, and he was talking about having a classmate while he was doing dissertation research in Sri Lanka. His classmate was a Shin priest from Japan, also studying Theravada Buddhism. And as he's learning about living Theravada culture in Sri Lanka, he's also learning a bit about what Buddhism's like in Japan. And he finds that, wow, there's actually a lot of similarity, whether we're talking about devotion or ordinary lay life. Part of what has made Shin Buddhism interesting to me is that the lay life seems to be the majority of the tradition. You have people who are ministers or whatever, but it's not as if they're more enlightened or they just have been taught to sing better, I guess, is one of the
Yeah.
main ones. So be able to lead the conversation rather than dominate the conversation, I guess.
Yeah. So it's not really a topic in the Shin tradition that like of course it's anyhow different in Japanese Buddhism,
Sure, sure.
ordained and monastic ordination and so, but in in some of the Tibetan schools or in some of the Tibetan systems of thought, there's a great deal of emphasis on monastic ordination as being the root of enlightenment itself, as being
Mm,
basically the prerequisite for becoming enlightened. This is contested by some of the, you might say, more non-conceptual schools like Mahamudra, Dzogchen, and some tantric aspects that
yeah.
put high emphasis on laity. But in
Mhm.
generally, I think also, whilst in the original culture, the monk or the nun might be an object of veneration for the laity, and for the laity that doesn't practice, for a practitioner, it may become self-devaluating.
Sure, sure.
Like
Yeah.
if I would find myself in a system where I would be deprived of the idea of enlightenment
Mm, sure,
when not being a monk, I would think, okay, why practice? And
sure.
that brings me to a point where you have like Buddha Amitabha as the Buddha figure that is not the historical Buddha, that is not the
Sure,
Buddha
sure.
with the story in this world, might also bring the Buddha more closely.
Interesting.
Initially, I felt like Buddha Amitabha with the sutras might be leading to a more abstract and more devotional Buddha, like almost like a religious Buddha, you know?
Sure, sure.
But at the same time, having a Buddha that is so intangible might be also bringing the Buddha more close to practitioners.
That's a really interesting point. I often think about how Amitabha and Avalokiteshvara or Tara are so closely connected. So if Amitabha then seems too remote, you have these other mediators who can seem very, very intimate. And something I've been thinking about recently is how ideas of motherhood are often associated with Amitabha, right? So Guan Yin, of course, is famously female, often in East Asian context. Tara has the vow to remain in female form. And then Amitabha is closely associated with the womb realm mandala, which is kind of perfect compassion and so on. Shinran Shonin refers to Amida as embodiment of motherly compassion and so on. That's the thing that I've been thinking about as well. Is like this Buddha does become kind of close, intimate. Yeah. So to your point about monasticism, I know some Shin practitioners that feel like it would be good if we had a more kind of dedicated monastic path because there are some people for whom that is the appropriate path. And for us to not have that is like depriving those people of not, being able to fulfill their vocation. I have another, one of my students was studying abroad in Japan, very into Jodo Shinshu, and he goes to these other festivals. He's volunteering at a Shin temple and all this. And then he goes to these other festivals and he says, where's all this stuff? We don't have spells. We don't have talismans. We don't have fortune telling. Like, we're not doing any of this other stuff. I like that stuff, but I also understand why we don't have it, right? So the doctrinal critique that which I've already mentioned is like we have complex practices that require a lot of education, a lot of time, a lot of money, are inaccessible to most people. So we should focus on what's accessible. But then also there's a political critique or an economic critique as well that these comprehensive schools are also working in support of the government. So basically, a monk is a government employee, right?
Mhm.
Who has received certain training and certain credentialing because they are serving the government. Yeah. Whether it's, helping you achieve rebirth in the Pure Land, helping the Emperor have a long life, dealing with the vengeful souls of the enemies you've slain on the battlefield, whatever you need them for, they're there to help with, right? So the critique then becomes there's no mediation, right? Because as you say, Amitabha Buddha is this, abstract thing is intimate. Like it's
Yeah.
you, it's part of you, it's within you and all around you. So who is this mediator who's trying to scare you? You had contracts in medieval Japan that say, if I don't fulfill my obligation with this contract, may the teeth and claws of the Buddha get me, right? There's a book called Teeth and Claws of the Buddha that's really fun. But the critique of this comprehensive approach that the single practice schools are bringing is, yes, you're comprehensive. It's all oneness. But this oneness in that context can also mean we own this. Like the government is in
Hmm.
control of all of your practices. But if you're choosing a single practice that has centuries of doctrinal argument saying this can contain the whole thing, and you take it out of context, then you deprive that whole power move. Right? And that's why
Yeah.
the warrior monks keep coming down the mountain to kill everybody. And Honin's, I believe it's Honin, his grave is like desecrated. They throw the body in the river. There's like, all this stuff keeps happening because the elite institutions are also aware of how dangerous this critique is because it can undo a lot of the power that they have. One of the funny things that happens with the Pure Land movement is what the persecution actually ends up doing. They round them up, they execute some of them, and they exile them to the provinces. Okay. So you've just taken this large group of charismatic teachers who want to tell poor people and women that they can be part of this great Buddhist thing. And now you've sent them to go live out in the country with all the poor people and women, and now they're teaching them. And that leads to this new movement that's really exclusively focused
Hmm.
on Amitabha to then become this powerful cultural force.
I thought, seeing parallels sometimes being stripped of all the elaboration of a transmission can also give an enormous power to what it brings to people. Like
Yeah, I
in,
think.
in present day Tibet, because I kind of grew up with exiled Tibetans, and I grew up with this story that, oh, there's like, we brought the teachings to Nepal, to India, but in Tibet, everything was destroyed. People don't really know anything anymore. The books are gone, the scholarship is gone, the practice is gone, the meditation is gone. And then the last years, but also it's a question of access, because there's
Mhm.
no direct communication to Chinese Tibet. So you have to like hear different stories. And there were people traveling and also scholars traveling, but I wasn't part of this. So to
Mm,
me, it reached rather lately. And I was like, wow, this actually led to a very new condensation of the Buddhist teachings
sure.
and also to again, a somewhat more modern adaptation because there was
Mhm.
the space.
The two time periods that I've worked on the most in Japanese history, one is the Kamakura period, the other is the Meiji period, and they're both referred to as periods of change. Like as opposed to
Hmm.
what? Like what are the
Yeah.
periods of not change, right? But maybe we have these periods of like radical sudden shift, and the way that people adapt. But I'm especially interested in the dropouts and the quitters and the people who figure it out on their own because they're often the ones that change things. The head of the monastic bureau with the top credentials, the front row student,
Yeah.
might not challenge the system. When the system is challenged, or there's a disaster or something, then people have to adapt, and that creativity is always really interesting to learn from and reflect upon. And I think we're seeing that in these examples here.
Thank you so much, Aaron.
So thank you. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed sharing some thoughts and learning with you. And let's
Yeah,
talk again
it's
sometime.